Hey everyone, it's Dr. Adam J. Bach. We are here to chat about customers. Just trying to get the camera to be aligned a little bit better here. We've all become AV experts in the modern world of Zoom and remote instruction. So what we're going to be doing is talking about three of the steps in disciplined entrepreneurship. And one of those, the only moments where we, for various reasons, skip a step to combine things that I felt were a little more aligned. But really, all we're talking about here is understanding customers in a very, very specific way and recognizing that there are some real challenges for entrepreneurs serving customers because of some of the preconceptions that we tend to bring to the table. So I'm going to get the deck launched here. It will also be available in Canvas, of course. But what I'm going to try to do is help clarify some of these things, hopefully give you a couple of examples that might be useful just from my own experience, of course. What we're trying to get at here is three concepts associated with customers. The first one is what we call the end user profile or the EUP. This is clarifying what the customer group actually looks like. You can think of it as another way of approaching the market segment, but in many ways, we're even getting more specific than the market segment. We're sort of imagining the specific characteristics of the kind of customer we really think is specifically going to buy whatever it is that we're producing and selling. The second piece is closely related to it, but distinct. It's called the persona. And a persona is a fictional representative of that end user profile, right? So the end user profile is sort of the larger macro perspective, and then we dive in and say, here's an imaginary ideal example of that end user profile, and we even usually give it a name. Finally, we want to step back and recognize that there's a whole life cycle to this purchasing process from the user's perspective, and there's a lot more steps in it than maybe we realized. And the more effectively we think about those steps, the more likely we are to figure out where we take action to get the customer to behave the way we're hoping them to behave, which is to buy the product. So just to kind of review, we want to remember that there is this key difference between pushing and pulling, right? A push-based technology, innovation, opportunity, where we have something and we want to convince people that they need it. And it's doable to be sure. And there are great examples of that. Many people consider the iPad to have been an example of a push opportunity because nobody was out there saying, I need this thing. I worry that that's oversimplistic because people had needs which weren't being met. They just hadn't thought of it in that way before. So we want to be careful about that. But what we're really looking for is that pull opportunity where customers are basically saying, here is my problem and I really need someone to solve it. Another way of approaching this is to suggest that maybe the great entrepreneurs are product, technology, and innovation agnostic. That means that they don't really care how they solve the problem. They just want to solve the problem, right? You might imagine that one of the problems in large industry is access to space, right? So companies would like to be able to put up satellites. They would like to have technology in space. We would like to be able to run experiments in space. But up until pretty recently, the only way to do that was to contract with NASA and to access these unbelievably expensive rockets, which were used precisely once. And there've been lots of different technologies proposed to get around that, things like called space elevators, rail guns. So there's no shortage of other ideas out here on how to do that. But the solution that has now been adopted for all practical purposes is reusable rockets, specifically the rocket boosters. And obviously that's been pioneered by SpaceX. And we can put aside any things around Elon and politics and all that because SpaceX has significantly changed the world of space exploration and rocketry, in particular for industry, by reducing the cost of putting things in orbit by probably a factor of 10. So it may be that Elon Musk and colleagues looked at lots of different ways to do this, but in the end, what they really cared about was getting things into space faster and cheaper. And the reusable rocket boosters turned out to be, at least for now, the best way to do that. So where possible, we want to encourage entrepreneurs to be agnostic about the solution. Sometimes the way that I tell when I'm mentoring entrepreneurs or working with a startup company, I will say, fall in love with the problem, not the solution that you think is the right one today, right? Because maybe it looks like a good idea, but ultimately it's not feasible. Wouldn't you rather solve the problem with a different solution than to work on your solution, which ultimately doesn't actually work? So how do we tackle all this? Well, at the first level, what we're going to do is build an end user profile. The idea is we've got our market set, maybe our beachhead market, and now we want to even narrow down further. We want to identify the highest potential, most cohesive group from within that beachhead market. And that could be a very small group. It could be as few as 3 or even 5 end users. In most cases, it's larger, dozens, maybe even hundreds or even thousands or more, depending on exactly what it is we're producing. Millions if we're doing things like entertainment or social media. But what we're trying to do is to make sure that we take this primary market research that we talked about and gets us to a profile. It's a highly specific set of characteristics around those very targeted end users that's going to help us make sure that whatever it is that we think we're providing them that solves their problem is in fact addressing those specific characteristics. I've just realized I don't have this in slideshow. Welcome to making mistakes in the real world. Here we go. So the book talks about a specific set of factors that we want to consider. And we recognize that most entrepreneurs and even most business people and even people who specialize in marketing often get caught at sort of what we call the surface level, which is just the demographics, things like how old people are, where they live, their education level. Are they college educated or do they only have high school education, et cetera, et cetera. And if you listen to the last presentation, you have probably heard me talk about the idea that what we're really going after is how customers behave, right? That people are in the same market group segment or same end user profile because faced with the same information, they make the same decision. And demographics are helpful, but it doesn't really predict their actual behavior, which is what we're going after. And so what we're trying to get to are factors that are related to their cognition, their psychology, and their prior and current behavior. So psychographics, things like what do they value? Who do they admire? What do they hope for in their lives? Recognizing proxy products that are comparable or related to the kinds of things that we might be selling. If they already buy organic milk, then the odds are good that they're going to be open to buying organic meat, things like that. Watering holes. That is, where do people like this get together to share information, whether it's online or whether it's, in a community center or a school or whatever, neighborhood get together, whatever it happens to be, because those choices about who they meet with also tells you about how they behave. In some cases, we like to do things like day in the life or what we sometimes call a customer journey model. If you're very interested in marketing, those are really good things to look up. And then things like key fears and motivations. What keeps them up at night? What's bothering them? What are they really trying to change in their lives? What would be meaningful for them? And these things that are below the surface are often the real drivers of the behavior. So assuming that we have been able to put together some type of end user profile, which incorporates many of those characteristics and elements, we now have this set of descriptors for this group. And that's an incredibly powerful thing because what we should be able to do is to map that to number one, whatever product or service offering that we are providing, which is going to enable us to uh, connect with those customers. And two, however it is, we're going to physically utilize channels to reach them because clearly the specific channels we use or the opportunities to communicate with them are going to make a difference, right? So whether we're communicating by telephone or by a website or social media or snail mail, whatever it happens to be, those factors are going to be the choices around that are going to be, and the way we position those is going to be driven around the sort of diagnostic criteria that we've created for that end user profile. With that, though, we would like to go one step further, which is to create a persona. So a persona is theoretically an actual human being. In most cases, we really don't mean an actual human being. We don't mean Adam J. Bach. What we mean is an idealized person within the end user profile group. So like this one person represents exactly the sort of person we're trying to get to. And although some people like to sort of try to choose an actual person, we strongly recommend a creating a fake person's name. And HubSpot has become famous for, in part, for generating personas that they then talk about both for their own business and for in their advisory marketing materials for other businesses. And it's often we give them sort of a funny name. So, we're looking for, we're trying to sell something, in the toy market. And so we have a persona named Silly Sally or something like that. The idea is that with this person in mind and with our team understanding what this person is like, we can have real conversations around how do we reach this kind of person? What does Sally think is important? How are they going to respond to marketing, communication, selling efforts, all these kinds of things? So again, the book sometimes talks about using a real name. That's a tricky thing to do, especially in some spaces. And so more often than not, we talk about a fictionalized name. But we do, in many cases, create exact information as if they were a real human being. We say this person earns $70,000 a year as a part-time accountant, in Stoughton, Wisconsin. They work 4 days a week. On weekends, their hobbies are as follows. Clearly, the entire end user profile group doesn't fit that, right? They don't all live in Stoughton working part-time as an accountant. But the idea behind it is that making it concrete makes it a lot easier for the team to then debate and discuss, propose, and say things like, well, what would Sally say in that context if Sally saw this ad? Or if a friend said, oh, I'm thinking of this, how would Sally respond to that? So it's important to recognize that these are very closely related concepts, but in many ways, they're very, very different. The profile is profile, broader profile, the subset of the market segment. The persona is the example. It's an avatar, if you will, of what that entire end user profile is like. We're using this because this is one of the most effective ways to motivate teams, right? This is this concept of a very specific sort of sometimes we call these things straw dogs, or examples that we can really then talk about, right? And so the textbook did have some examples, Mary Marketing, KDL, and so on. And that's really what we're going after here because we're trying to humanize the customer from being something that just pays money to accomplish something to being an actual decision maker, right? And many entrepreneurs kind of lose that. In their mind, they are often that end user, right? And that's one of the tricky things about all of this is sort of not getting into situations where we've lost track of who that really is. So for example, here might be, sort of a little bit of a persona template around that. where you would want to identify very specific things like information sources, like where do they get their news from? Like what websites do they go to? And again, if we're doing this in a fake way, we'll want to make those up, but it's important for us to recognize that there should be similarities across, our end user profile. And so our persona example should be indicative of that. Is this the kind of person who watches MSNBC, or are they a Fox News person, or do they not have a television? Maybe they get all of their information via, a Google News feed or something like that. We're then trying to recognize how they prioritize things that drive their behavior and their purchasing decisions. So in this particular example here on this slide, where we're talking about someone who manages a data center, presumably here now the issue is that we are trying to sell them something associated with business, right? So this is not meant to be a consumer example. And so in the context of someone who manages a data center, it very well could be that the reliability, the uptime of that data center is their number one issue. It's the thing that keeps them up at night. It uses up all their time. If they could ask for one thing in the world, it would be that they had, 5.9 reliability for the data center. And so everything else is going to be secondary to that. Sure, we want to grow the utilization levels of the data center. Maybe keeping costs down is also an issue. Do we want the data center to be green? Yeah, I mean, I can believe that. Maybe, Chuck here wants, he's eco-friendly and everything like that. But well-intentioned as a human being, he may not have that quite within his official job responsibility, right? And if he has to let that go because reliability is more important, he's probably going to make that decision because in some ways his job may depend on it. And we can talk about all the ethics and morality and issues and climate change. And I'm always happy to have those kinds of conversations. But it's really important that you not lose track of why people make the decisions that they do in jobs that they're in. So I will tell you a very quick story about this. One of my investment groups invested in a company that had a better diagnostic test for food pathogens, things like E. coli and Salmonella. And you may have seen the cyclosporin outbreak that's still going on around the United States at the time that I'm recording this, which is summer of 2026. And so this startup company had this very cool diagnostic test that was much better at identifying those kinds of pathogens associated with meat processing. And you'd think, well, that's good for everybody, right? I mean, if there's pathogens in the meat, we want to know about it. And we invested in the company, and you know what? They were not successful at all. And it was in many ways my fault because when we did our primary research, I did not contact enough plant managers, meat processing plant managers, because once I got into, afterwards we were doing some postmortem work and I ended up being in contact with some people. And they told me something that at the time I was a little bit horrified by, but in context makes sense, which was, they don't want tests that exceed the federally mandated levels, right? They want to test for what they're required to test for because that's what they're legally responsible for. And testing at a higher sensitivity level means shutting the plant down more when they detect really, really small amounts of those pathogens, which they're not legally required to do. And every time the plant shuts down, it's a massive expense that they're on the hook for. And so they may believe in public health, they may want to sell a safe product, but all of that is defined by the legal requirements. And asking them to pay more for their plant to be less efficient and to cost the parent company more is not an attractive proposition for that plant manager because it means that they will look worse to their employer. And we might argue that that still would be better for society. Maybe it would be, but it's really hard to ask someone in a job to do something like that. So getting to this question of the founder persona is the sort of last piece of this that's really critical to recognize, which is, in terms of our end user profile and our market segment, our ideal persona should be right smack in the middle of it, right? They should be sort of a mean or a median or a mode of what the rest of that looks like. And very often the problem here is that the founder, the entrepreneur, is roughly within the market segment or the EUP, but not really, maybe off on one side or a couple standard distributions away. And this then leads them to unintentionally target people like themselves instead of the core of the market space. And as you might imagine, that means that you're only going to sell effectively and provide a product or service that works effectively for a very small subcomponent of that market space. Um, and the book defines a couple of different biases around this. You should know what they are. The market drift one to me is the most interesting, right? It's the idea that over time, these preferences may also shift, and the founders' preferences may not shift with them. And we see that all the time with people who sort of fall in love with their technology or their product, and then they can't change. One, they can't recognize that the larger market is different, and two, they can't change as the market changes. So this is, again, all about falling in love with the problem, not the solution. It's all about recognizing that the founder, while good to have emotion and passion around the technology or the idea, can't get so caught up in it as to think that they are representative of the entire market. And there's no shortage of, startup companies and technology ventures that in some cases have been wildly successful. And then as markets have shifted, the entrepreneur, the founder, the team has been unable to shift with the market. They're unable to wrap their heads around the change that's happening at the customer level, and they're unable to then adapt the product or the technology to accomplish that. One of the most compelling ways to approach customers, especially for an entrepreneurial venture, is to recognize that in most cases, people and organizations, they're not, yes, they're buying products or services, but they're doing that because they have a job to do. So, one of the examples that I like to suggest is the example of a hammer. So you're a college student, you've just arrived in your dorm room, and because you love your family, you want to put up a framed photo of your family on the wall, and you have a nail. And so what do? Well, most people go out and they buy this weirdly shaped lump of steel, which we generally call a hammer. And then they nail that into the wall if it's not the cinder block that's in some of the UW-Madison dorms. And then they hang up the picture. And that's great. You had a problem, you solved it. But the upshot is that embedded in this is sort of this implication that what this student needed was a weirdly shaped lump of steel. And now this weirdly shaped lump of steel sits under the bed or in a drawer for, another 9 months without being used once. What the student actually needed was a hole in the wall, right? And if you think about it, if I had turned up at the door right before they went to the hardware store and said, "Hi, I have this magic wand, and for 10 cents, I can create a hole in the wall that your nail will be stuck in." So which is the better solution? Is it the hammer, or was it the 10-cent wave of the magic wand? To be sure, sometimes you need a hammer for more than one thing. Maybe you're going to use it again. But if it really was a one-time use, then that's really, really inefficient. Not only did you spend way more than 10 cents on the hammer, but now you got this thing sitting around all the time. So don't kind of get too caught up in the idea that the product is what you are selling. What you're selling is the solution that the customer needs. What job do they need done, right? So the example of that meat packing plant, the plant manager needs to get a certain amount of meat packaged out of that facility while following all applicable laws. And then from there, to the extent that it's done safely and at a low cost and maybe green, fantastic, right? But when you lose track of the job that people are trying to do, then the odds that you will offer something that doesn't solve their problem go up and up and up and up. And we see that all the time in startups and tech ventures where people have something and it's really cool, but it's not solving the customer problem in the best possible. So from there, what we're really going after then is understanding the life cycle of the acquisition, the purchase. And for many entrepreneurs, we're so focused on that sale and the use, right? We sell it and they use it. And huzzah, we have won this particular battle. And that may or may not be true. But the reality is that the life cycle of the customer experience is what drives the success of the venture in the longer haul. The book talks about an extensive workflow map. This is not written in stone, although it's good to be aware of what the textbook specifically talks about. If you want to see other examples of this, you can go online and look at things like journey maps, journey models, customer journey models, or customer journey maps. Those are an insanely helpful tool, and there's no shortage of templates out there to really help you walk through all of this. Because what we're shooting for is recognizing where in these processes we can really make a difference, right? Just to be a little stupid about this, if you are selling the magic wand and you arrive at the dorm door after the student has bought the hammer, it's too late. I mean, maybe they'll try it. But the point is that you missed the trigger, right? You missed the trigger and they've already bought something and they're much more likely to work with what they have, even though your solution is so much better in so many ways. And so recognizing whether you need to get to them when they're determining the need or where the trigger is in terms of their analysis. Do you need to be involved in an install process? Is that where there's value? How do they pay you? When do they pay you? How do you provide support? All of those things make a huge difference. And you can see this in the world that we live in. If you go to Amazon and look at the reviews for a given product, you will often discover that customers give sellers and products 4 or 5 stars, even in cases where they returned the product because they said the support or the service was really good. Clearly, if they didn't keep the product or something went horribly wrong with it, we would want to understand that and be aware of it. But many of us also do make purchase decisions based upon the ability to get good support from the companies and organizations that we are buying from. The idea is that we're trying to align all of this together, right? The great product shouldn't be the end all and be all. A great product is a good thing, right? But we can look at many, many great products that were wildly unsuccessful. My personal favorite is the Segway, the scooter thing with the gyroscopes. Amazingly cool technological product, total failure in the market space. What we're trying to get to is to use the profile and to use that persona and an understanding of that life cycle to be prepared to really well match what we think the product or technology or solution is to the problem that needs to be solved, and to address it in a way that works for the customer, right? Not for us as the entrepreneur. If we are completely bound up in what we're trying to do, we're very likely to miss what's actually going to happen at the customer site. So hopefully this has given you some things to think about. Key ideas of that end user profile, the persona, and then this sort of life cycle are the concepts that we're going for here. And they're critical steps in this whole entrepreneurial process.